Good morning, Ohio State fans. Welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Thursday, October 9th. I'm joined by one of our leading voices on the Ohio State athletics beat, Andy Anders. Andy, how are you doing today, as we're
Great,
recording
even
tonight?
better to be heard called a leading voice of the Ohio State beat. I'm flattered, George. That was quite kind of you.
Well, you're one of our leading voices on the beat, but I'm sure that you've garnered plenty of respect in the circle at large as well. But you've more than earned it at this point, I think. Following up on something that we talked about last week, we spoke about the Ohio State running back rotation and the propensity for Bo Jackson to potentially become a bell cow. And that took an interesting shape coming out of this Minnesota game and is something that I think bears examining again as we prepare for Ohio State to take on a defense or a school with a coach that, at least I think to some extent, likes to pride themselves on a grindier approach to football. So you would think the running game, unless Ohio State is able to follow a similar game script to the one that Indiana did against Illinois, would come into effect pretty heavily this weekend. But before we get into that, we do want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, the official bank of 11 Warriors and the 11 Dubcast this Ohio State football season. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Now, I know I just set up all that topic, but of course, what we're actually going to talk about today is how enthusiastic Andy is about Joe Flacco becoming a new member of the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm just kidding. I'm more enthusiastic than he is, and I'm a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. So
Well, you
getting
have
back
Jamar
to
Chase
the
in fantasy. That's the part you gotta give that context a little bit in
you
there.
could call that a conflict of interest of sorts, I guess, relative to my Pittsburgh Steelers fandom. Getting back to the actual topic at hand, though, so as I set up earlier, I think it's reasonable to expect, especially for an outfit that kind of prides itself on being somewhat of an NFL feeder school like Ohio State is, that they would reflect a professional approach to the game of football and constructing their football roster. So the typical thinking with a running back rotation in the NFL, I think, is you want a pair and a spare. So you don't want, even though we all love bell cows dearly, and it's great to see one running back get the bulk of the workload and shine with it. From a realistic winning perspective, depth is very valuable, and you want to have a number of names, usually at least two guys that you can really rely on at the position. Look no further than Ohio State last season when they leaned on the duo of Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson and saw both of those guys not only achieve 1,000 yards, but also become very high end of the second round, at least NFL draft picks. So we were looking at the running back rotation coming out of the Washington game, and it appeared that they were starting to get more confident in Bo Jackson, which was evident coming out of the Ohio game. But at that point, coming out of the Ohio game, there was still a pretty even three-way split between CJ Donaldson and Bo Jackson and James Peoples. They all got the same even amount of touches on the ground. Then it became more of the Donaldson and Jackson dynamic in the Washington game. Jackson seemed to do a little bit more with his touches. Then it was interesting what happened with Minnesota, because the clear lion's share of the touches in the valuable stage of the game, the non-garbage time stage of the game, if you will. And you can imagine in a game that ends 42-3, there's probably going to be a decent amount of garbage time. Most of it went to Bo Jackson. CJ Donaldson did get another touchdown, but he also only had 3 carries for 3 yards. James Peoples ended up getting twice as many carries as Donaldson did, but most of those were when the game was already pretty far out of reach. Didn't necessarily have a bad game with the work that he did get, but again, it was largely when the game was out of reach. You would think that in a game that had as much of a discrepancy as in the scoring as this one did, that Ohio State would have leaned on the running game a little bit more. Now, I wanted to see them lean on the pass more coming into this game, so I was fine with things unfolding the way that they did. I'm just speaking in a general context of how you would kind of expect things to play out. And we're now at the stage where we've gone from a three-way split in the backfield to a two-way split in the backfield to kind of surprising to see Ohio State lean on Bo Jackson as heavily as they did last week relative to the other guys. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that relative to what we spoke about last week, and if you think that they're going to stick more in this rhythm of leaning on one guy going forward during the valuable stages of the game, or if you think we're going to see more of an even split. And given who they've been kind of alternating with between Peoples and Donaldson, who do you think is more likely to get that work as being second fiddle, so to speak, behind Bo Jackson?
It's all good questions, and I think it's interesting when you look at it because Bo only ended up with 13 carries in this game. Like you said, they ran the ball generally less. And I think there was an overall emphasis on being more explosive. You weren't the only one that wanted to see Ohio State throw the ball more. I think that was a very public call. And not to say that Ryan Day is sitting there listening to the message boards and taking his football advice from that. But I think there was a real emphasis on um, opening up the passing game and getting more on Julian Saint's plate, allowing him to attack downfield against Minnesota. I'll be interested to see if that carries over at Illinois because Ryan has again kind of pumped the brakes, similar to how he did going into the Washington game of like running the ball is going to be important, controlling the clock, managing possessions, not turning the ball over, all those sorts of things. So we'll see. But as the distribution of carries goes, like I wonder what will happen when they do have a game where they run the ball. Those three guys are splitting more like 30 carries as opposed to the low 20s like they were at for this past game. I think Bo, I've said it a couple of times already on various locations, various platforms when I've, just given my thoughts on this. I think 15 touches is right around what you want to put on the freshman's plate for wear and tear purposes to keep everyone fresh in that running back room. 15 carries a game or touches, and that includes receptions. And then maybe you can amp that up a little bit come postseason time when, you're leaving it all out there, no gas left in the tank sort of a thing. But he was right around that number again against Minnesota, had one catch as well, I believe. So ended up with 14 touches total, runs plus receptions. For me, I think James People started to make a case to be the number two running back at the end of the game. And he and Donaldson might just be 2A and 2B. You often hear 1A, 1B for guys at the top of a depth chart, like Quinshawn and Travion were last year. They might be 2A and 2B now if James continues to play the way he did against Minnesota. Look, I know it was in garbage time, but Minnesota still had its first team defense out there against Ohio State's second team offense. And James ran with just a different viciousness, a different motor. That's a term that you use for defensive linemen, but like it was the first time this season I've seen him consistently slip arm tackles and not get brought down by a shoelace when he had the chance to. See him make some guys miss. That was good to see. And frankly, what I was expecting from him coming into the year when you heard Travion Henderson compare him to J.K. Dobbins during the NFL scouting combine and these other things. Like it his vision was the best it's been. He found some holes that weren't clear at first when you look at the tape. Had to bounce some things or cut some things back to make the most of certain runs, and he did that. So far and away, the best performance James Peoples was had, with the caveat it was 7 carries in garbage time against Minnesota, but that's the kind of production and the kind of running that had me thinking coming into the year he would be the star of this backfield before Bo Jackson clearly like within his first two outings, like he didn't play against Texas, two performances, it was clear Bo Jackson was the best running back in this room. But CJ Donaldson still has his role as a short yardage back. That being said, when they get to the big games in the postseason, maybe Michigan, maybe the Big Ten championship game too, which technically postseason, but a college football playoff after that. Uh, CJ is good in short yardage. He has corrected some of the pad level things that gave him issues in the past against Ohio, against Washington, being stuffed on a couple of 1 yard, 4th and 1s basically. But I think Bo Jackson's their best short yardage back too, is the thing. You watch the guy, I great running backs when like short yardage backs, but great running backs in general always have a way to fall forward. And when you watch Bo Jackson, the way he finishes runs, he has that pad level and he's always falling forward. And it was clear on the 5 yard touchdown run he had against Minnesota, where like he carried two defenders the last 2 yards and stuck it across the goal line. Ryan Day yelled at him for reaching the ball out like that because fumble risk, but still, it was an impressive touchdown run. And that's been the character of any time he goes up the middle and gets a chance to finish runs through contact. He is great at slipping arm tackles with strong legs and high knees. He is great at falling forward in that way. So Donaldson's still going to have that niche, I think. Again, to take some of the dirty yards, some of those hits off Bo Jackson's body. And I think CJ Donaldson is still, a fine running back in his own right. But Bo Jackson is the best in everything now when it comes to running the football. That was the last sort of question I had about him. And I think he's shown recently, and he did it against Washington too, that he's also their best power back, their best short yardage back. So when push comes to shove later in the season, I think the distribution might thin a little bit, and it does become like the same percentage we saw against Minnesota, but not just because they're running the ball less, because Bo might get it 20 times when they're playing these bigger games late in the year. For now, still expect similar distributions to what we saw earlier, where keep Bo around 15 touches and the other two guys get in that like 5 to 8 carry range, and work out who actually is your 2A, 2B between James Peoples and CJ Donaldson, and see if Peoples can replicate what he did at the end of that Minnesota game.
Yeah, I suppose I did sort of open this by dumping the bucket of cold water on people's performance, which when you look at it a little bit further, you really could say that it was probably his best game of the season so far. You brought up a good point relative to most of the first team guys for Minnesota still being in the game. He did average almost 8.5 yards per carry with the touches that he got. Now, most of that was built into one 33-yard run that he had during the game. You take that away, and then that goes down to 6 carries for 26 yards, which isn't nearly as glamorous, but it's still right around at the
4.5, yeah.
average, close to what Bo Jackson had for himself with all of his touches this game. And the big knock on Peoples was, and a big reason why Bo Jackson got asserted into the front of this rotation, if you want to call it a rotation at this point, was Jackson had the bigger propensity for the explosive plays. So for Peoples to have a play of over 30 yards, that was the biggest thing that was missing in terms of, I think, what people anticipated when they had high hopes for him coming into the season. It is encouraging to see him have a play like that in the event that they would need to have somebody spell Bo Jackson, or heaven forbid somebody were to get hurt. You feel a little bit more encouraged, I think, coming out of this performance, that given the performance that Peoples had, that maybe he's starting to round into form a little bit more. Now, you already touched on a lot of the short yardage stuff with relative to Donaldson and Jackson, which was what we talked about when you were on the show at the back end of last week. That was going to be my question for you. You did kind of address it already in a certain sense, but the fact that he only got 3K, still got the touchdown again, but the fact that he only got 3 carries and that we did see more of Jackson getting deployed around the red zone in this game, what is your, you talked about that you would expect them to kind of lean more on Jackson in a hypothetical sense, in more of those short yardage situations, despite the fact that it seems like Donaldson coming out of the Washington game seems to have corrected the pad level and falling forward issue a little bit. But what is your confidence in terms of what you've seen from these last couple of games that Donaldson is going to be able to firmly entrench himself in that role, relative to the fact that we know at this point that Jackson is going to be the guy that falls forward, that is going to be hitting the hole in an explosive fashion, regardless of what the circumstances are? Feels like you have a certainty with Jackson in terms of performing in that role, but ideally you would want to keep things evenly distributed and to have Donaldson continue to thrive in that role as opposed to having to kind of work him out of the rotation and then leaving him without really an opportunity to shine. And that would just expose Bo Jackson, even though we, again, love a bell cow in a hypothetical sense. It's better when you are able to offload responsibility from the plate to keep people as fresh as possible. So, are you confident that Donaldson is going to be able to lock down this role given the schedule coming up? Or would you anticipate that Jackson is going to get more of the lion's share of work in the red zone and eventually around the goal line as the season evolves?
Right, that's, I mean, that's exactly it. You summed it up pretty well, is you'd love to have Donaldson be that guy, even if Jackson's better at it ultimately, and I think he is, and I think a lot of people, when you watch the game, it's kinda clear he is, so, yeah, I don't think I'm breaking any ground with that, but if Donaldson can consistently and, really consistently fix those pad level issues and pick up those dirty yards, then absolutely you wanna lean on him, right? And, um to me, I do have a confidence in that because you look at Donaldson's career coming into this season. He had what he was at West Virginia was very consistent. It was back-to-back 800-yard seasons, exactly. It was both years were right around 4.5 yards per carry. He had the exact same number of touchdowns both years. And you translate that into a defined role, a senior with who's a veteran and who is willing to embrace, I think, what that entails. He spoke after the Washington game and took ownership of that pad level issue and really emphasized that he wants to be the guy who gets dirty yards in this offense and be that. So he's embracing it, and I think he has the skill set. And when you have those two things combined, I think he'll still be a really good short yardage back and can take those reps, those hits off of Bo Jackson's plate to keep him fresher, to keep him more liable to break off a big run when they need it. Yeah, I do have decent confidence that CJ Donaldson can be that guy. He's not going to be the big playback in this offense, but that's not what they're going to ask him to do anymore. It's in the red zone, like you said, short yardage, like you said, get the dirty yards, take the hits off Bo Jackson, and with that role clearly defined, I think he's got the mentality that you need to embrace that.
Yeah, I would agree with you, and I certainly hope it pans out that way. Again, we love a bell cow in a hypothetical sense, but I don't know how, as an Ohio State fan, you can watch last season and not think it's great when everybody eats. So I would like to see as many people as possible eat in this backfield for the sake of this team getting as many wins as possible. So it's been interesting to see how things have evolved the last 3 games. Obviously, we want to continue to see improvement. We're going to have a chance to see how those improvements manifest themselves against a very grindy opponent in a theoretical sense this weekend when they go on the road to take on the Fighting Illini and Brett Bielema's crew. So I'm looking forward to seeing that. I'm looking forward to helping you guys cover the game a little bit this weekend. Illinois quietly the highest ranked opponent that Ohio State will have played this season in the sense of how the other ones have kind of shifted. So it'll be interesting to see if they are able to get it done this weekend. What happens to Illinois' ranking if they unfortunately get yet another opponent to drop out of the AP top 25 before we get even to technically what is the halfway point of the season. But we are on the cusp of that, and we'll be back to preview that game tomorrow with Dan Hope. Until then, Andy, thank you very much for joining me tonight to talk the running backs again in the Ohio State offense. Thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast, and thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio. We'll be back tomorrow to preview the Illinois game. Tune in then. Take care, folks.